The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 28.
Lysella planned for the ambush to occur right there in Zurlus's throne room, in the presence of the fire giant king and his court. She wanted for the king to see her destroy Kaylee after she pleaded for her life. The throne room was a majestic hall with 8 colossal columns reaching nearly 100 feet to the ceiling at its highest. The hall itself was over 200 feet long. At the end of the hall was a semicircle dais that held the ancient throne of giants on its onyx platform, the throne of King Zurlus. This massive hall had been carved out of the mountain by the hands of humanoids, mostly dwarves. Even the columns themselves were cut out of the volcanic stone. They were decorated with intricate etchings and artwork depicting the power of giants over all other beings. The giants had spent 270 years building Zitefetin, having only recently completed its construction. For centuries, the fire giant lords had been scattered throughout the western mountains. They could no longer hold any ground on the flat world, where they once reigned supreme. The lack of sustenance caused their kind to dwindle further. After the disaster, what the humans refer to as the Last Great Giant War, over 300 years earlier, they were forced to retreat into the jagged cliffs. Yet their confidence grew steadily as Zitefetin neared completion, which attracted more of their kind to gather here and at other bases from all other parts of the known world. Then they attracted other allies, and those they believed were their allies, including the Dark Elves from the underworld. But the drow were only interested in the Golden Plateau, and Kaylee's mission was simply to fleece it from the giants. But to do that, she needed to see to their final destruction. It was the drow that encouraged the giants to pillage, plunder, and attempt to retake the flatlands from the humans, knowing full well that the giants stood no chance of any sustained success. To help continue their war, the drow purchased their many dwarven slaves, including Welki, in exchange for their guidance, magic, and guile. These dwarven slaves would be used to extract the vast treasures of the Golden Plateau and allow the drow their final revenge over the High Elves. Kaylee planned to reassert her authority, and just like Dan, complete her mission today. There were 2 large arching stone benches that flanked the king's throne. They were normally reserved for his family members or venerated guests, as Kaylee had been. Tonight, they were occupied by 4 fire giant lords from 4 distant mountain outposts. These lords brought their best men with them to gain powerful new armaments here, and then participate in the first raids on the land's east. These next incursions into human lands were set to begin the following spring. Apart from these guests, there were 12 royal guards always present in the throne room. These fire giants were the best of Zurlus's men, and were always heavily armored. They were usually out of sight, but only just beyond the curtains surrounding the hall. Also nearby were Zurlus's 2 mighty shieldmen, who stood guard by his quarters, where he and his family resided. Lastly, there were 2 hall guards just outside the massive double doors leading to the foyer entrance of the fortress. So there were at least 20 fire giants that would be present to witness the planned coup and assassination. Lysella was joined by her sister Etizia and 9 of their best male fighters. Gerbanik, Kaylee's most loyal drow suitor, was instructed to bring his 6 best male fighters by both Lysella and Kaylee. So there would be 18 drow present as well. Throughout the keep were dozens more giants and creatures of all types roaming the subterranean passages. But for now, Kaylee's focus would be on the throne room and revenge. Dan and Kaylee were fully geared and ready. She pointed to the massive double doors just beyond the Hall of Splendor. "That is where I'll seal the door. That will prevent any further reinforcements." She then pointed to an area behind the throne. "But there is a door here that leads to Zurlus's personal quarters. He may retreat there to protect his queen and brood. It's very important that they are destroyed as well," she said coldly.
What about this door?
Dan pointed to a door on the other side of the throne room. "That leads below. That's where we get out if something unexpected happens and we are separated."
All right, let's go,
Dan said, nodding and brimming with pre-combat excitement. Kaylee paused to take in his beauty. She smiled at him and then kissed him deeply before beginning her incantation. Lysella was expecting Kaylee and Dan to appear as scheduled in about 20 more minutes through the staircase that Dan had pointed to on the map. That was how the drow normally entered when summoned by the king. But Kaylee teleported herself and Dan directly into the Hall of Splendor by the huge double doors that were the entrance to the throne room. Without acknowledging the gathered evil at the other end of the hall, she cast a wizard lock on the double doors. Dan saw Zurlus opposite the massive hall, seated atop his throne. His instincts were to charge Zurlus first, but he tempered his vengeance and stuck to the plan. The two approached slowly down the length of the marble floors, expressionless and without words. To Dan's left, and much closer, were Lysella and her 10 family members. To his right were Gerbanik and the Zastiri contingent. Lysella had a mocking grin on her face, completely self-assured of her planned outcome. But suddenly, without warning, Dan charged the Oguata males, who responded slowly. Dan rolled into them as Lysella cried out, "They're attacking!" Lysella retreated behind her line of males as Dan knocked several of them to the ground forcefully. The others attempted to surround him as they drew their long knives and set their tiny crossbows. Dan struck quickly, dropping 3 others with 3 successive blows. The bolts that were fired could not find their target. He closed in quickly and hacked down 3 more. "Kill them, Gerbanik," Kaylee commanded, and her men obeyed, encircling the others. She then charged in with her mace and whip. "Lysella, command them!" cried her sister Etizia, whose head was cut off moments later by Silveroon. Zurlus and the other giants looked on, quite amused by the violence. They were unsure what the drow were fighting about, but Kaylee was right. They certainly didn't expect it to involve them. Lysella attempted to hold Gerbanik and his men that were charging, but before she could finish her enchantment, Kaylee fired a lightning bolt into her chest, flinging her towards the dais. One of Zurlus's trusted hellhounds was spooked by the explosion and charged instinctively, biting Lysella and breathing fire on her for good measure. She cried out in agony. The 4 giant lords laughed with Zurlus as the 12 royal guardsmen then sprung into position around the throne platform. In less than a minute, Lysella and her guard of drow males were completely annihilated. Kaylee approached the dais and smashed Lysella's face 3 times viciously with her mace to finish her off. The few remaining drow males were then ordered to return beneath to protect her quarters. They filed out quickly through the small passageway to the left of the throne room.
"Mistress Kaylee, what is this meeting you've called?"
asked Zurlus in his native dialect, so his fellow fire giant lords might better understand. His deep voice was calm as it echoed in the massive chamber.
"Couldn't you have made this mess in your own space down beneath?"
he asked, observing the bloodied drow bodies strewn on his rocky floor. Some of the fire giant lords laughed, but Zurlus was growing increasingly concerned by the human man with the glowing sword that approached quickly behind her. "Oh, certainly not, my king," You are this meeting's most honored guest, she answered with a wry smile as she dropped her mace and reattached her whip to her waist. Her eyes glowed with excitement as she began her next powerful incantation. The three hellhounds growled and barked at her as she spoke louder. Zurlus stood up. He was without his weapons or armor, so rather than await Kayleigh's next move, he secreted through a portal installed behind his throne. Moments later, a cone of cold struck the entire dais, killing the hellhounds and causing the fire giant lords tremendous damage. Zurlus narrowly escaped to his quarters. The royal guards charged at Kayleigh, and she vanished from their sight. But then, Dan called out to them.
Over here.
He said, tapping Silveroon into the black marble floor. It sparked, whistled and hummed as tiny parts of stone were cracked and displaced. These were the best of Zurlus's fighters, armed with full plate mail, mined from the iron fields in the Golden Plateau, forged and fitted by dwarvish master smithies, to be impenetrable for most human-wielded weapons. These were the giants that would be the lead juggernauts of the giants' planned attack. As these heavily armed royal guardsmen closed in on him, Dan charged them in turn. But his first attack was rebuffed. A prideful throne guardsman struck Dan in the face with a jab from his buckler, which sent Dan back several feet. Two other guardsmen closed in around him and readied for attack. The first swung down mightily with his massive two-handed sword. As the sword struck down, just to his right, Dan pivoted off the giant's instep, leapt, spun, and then slashed behind the fire giant's forward leg. The giant groaned and fell forward. Dan then rolled and stepped in further where he could slash it in the back. Another charged gleefully, wielding a red-hot morning star that had been heating in the fire prior to battle. The spiked clubs spun on the chain, sparking and flaring off the obsidian floor as Dan dodged each attack. Kayleigh's fire resistance spell enabled him to then reverse through the fire and turn into his attacker as the giant withdrew the weapon. Dan stepped past him quickly, running Silveroon through the giant's massive armored body. The giant looked at Dan in disbelief as he dropped down into his own spilled innards. The haste magic gave Dan enhanced speed and initiative, which he used repeatedly and effectively. The giants surrounded him and proceeded into battle methodically. Yet as each one took their best shot, Dan would force an abrupt change in the giant's defensive posture through his quick movements and feints. He'd then create an opening to pass between them and get near their crouched legs. That's all it took. Delivering even an innocuous, swiping connection with Silveroon might end up proving fatal. Time again, the sword exploded in light and sound as contact was made, and another gargantuan armored warrior was felled. But the guardsmen charged on. They came at Dan with great power and fury, only to be met by a power greater and a fate foretold. Any single one of their angry blows would strike down any other human. But when Dan's giant strength combined with Silveroon's power and supernatural weight, the giant's deadly blows were parried and sometimes even forced back. As their numbers dwindled, the guardsmen resorted to grabs and punches in an effort to stay clear of Dan's sword range. Dan had surprised them. Now he was overwhelming them. But being the mightiest fire giants in the known world, they were getting some good shots in on him. Two of the giants attempted to tackle him, thrusting their weight down to pin him. He escaped their clutches, using Silveroon to wedge a path between them. Dan fought brilliantly, but as the intense melee continued on without interruption, he began to tire. We didn't have to resort to the sticky roofing tar, but the flour did seem to take to my hair nicely. Thelb actually had quite a bit of experience with disguise makeup. I was impressed how well he was able to do us up when he put his mind to it. At first glance, we actually looked like a couple of drow, just one with an abnormally large butt. That would be me.
Take this.
Thelb held a scroll of teleportation.
Remember, we're not here to kill anyone. Especially not her.
He looked for acknowledgement, and I gave it.
When you found Tnuviel, just get out of there. Don't talk, or hug him, or...
Yes, Thelb, I said emphatically, swiping the scroll from his grasp. You know, this is actually a good look for you, I joked.
Leave, whenever you can. I will find you, later.
He said calmly. We exchanged nods, and then both became invisible. We then retraced my steps into the underground labyrinth. Thelb watched my footprints in the gravelly ground and followed closely behind. We chose not to use telepathy, for we heard the drow were very keen to intercept it. At first, my distraction idea was rejected out of hand by Nuna. She thought it silly to suggest she could somehow convince mountain giants to aid us against the fire giants. But my feeling was the mountain giants were made unhappy mostly by all of the sudden changes, like the ones created at Dedok. That seemed to really irritate them and stoke their awesome power. They might also be persuaded that the fire giant fortress, also relatively new, had brought them nothing but trouble, particularly with the human invasions into the mountains. Like the Golden Plateau, its existence was now a beacon for unwanted attention by humans into their last hallowed homeland. Nuna remained dubious but offered me the benefit of the doubt. She would try. When we reached their lands, we separated. Thelb and I went towards Zytefetin, and she sought them out. Nuna was a priestess of the natural world, and like the mountain giants, a true neutral. She found them remarkably easily, and they took a liking to her right away. They told her how the invading humans had tricked them into a battle at Dedok, only to leave them sleeping many miles from home. They then found themselves rudely awakened and ridiculed by the fire giants after their next battle at Dedok, which they learned they were unable to destroy the first time. It was a frightening check on their power to regulate these mountains. She listened compassionately and encouraged them, as I suggested. They were angry now. I thought it might be helpful if they could maybe attract some attention to the main entrance, similar to how we had planned our first incursion, just with a much more unexpected event. I hoped they'd make some noise calling out in their subsonic dialect, or stomp around or something. But what they did surprised everyone. Before the time Thelb and I finished our disguise, broke off, and made for the dragon's hole, Nuna had incited the three mountain giants to smash the fire giant fortress completely. One of the mountain giants brought his mighty wooden club, consisting of 7 thick pine trees tied together as one. The mighty giant was incensed by the chaos that had been brought upon the lands, saying so angrily in its subsonic tongue. It raised aloft the massive tree club and struck down with all its strength on the mountainside that housed Zytefetin. Did you hear that? I asked Thelb as we approached the rear entrance to the dragon's den.
Sounded like thunder,
he answered. Then there was another impact. The ground itself shook beneath our feet. The massive impact echoed throughout the cavern. That's coming from the other side of the mountain. Do you think? I stopped asking my question as another mammoth mountain giant made some far too close, ground-shaking steps over our position. It then stopped about a quarter mile from us, looked up, and shrilled into the sky with a much higher pitch. Then it forced its two massive hands down upon the side of the mountain. We both fell down from the impact. One of the fire giant lords backhanded Dan with its frozen fist, causing it to break into pieces. It fell into Dan and swatted at him with his other arm. But Dan parried its shots and then lopped off its remaining arm. Kaylee fired a volley of magic missiles into the last giant lord left standing on the dais. Another tried to regain his feet and attack her, and she finished him off with another volley, leaving one missile to slay a pet gargoyle that was squawking annoyingly in its cage above her. Dan fell to one knee, gasping for breath. His heart was beating rapidly. He had swung his sword with full strength nearly 50 times. The 12 royal guardsmen had all been slain, as had the 4 giant lords, the 2 outer hall guards, the 3 hellhounds, and about a dozen drow. But the battle was not yet done.
Zurlus!
Dan barked out.
Where did he go?
This way. Kaylee showed Dan to the door, which led to the king's rear quarters. She used knock magic to thrust open the massive double doors. Just after the large portal was opened, they heard and felt a massive exterior impact. The ground shook as dust and small pieces of rock fell from the ceiling.
Are they trying to get through?
Dan pointed to the double doors beyond the Hall of Splendor. That came from outside, she answered, quite surprised. As another impact sounded, Kaylee looked up to the cracking ceiling with suspicion, while Dan made his way through the portal to the king's rear quarters. Dan made several confident strides down a marble hall until he was knocked down by a giant forked spear. It was one of Zurlus' personal guard. The giant stabbed down with the spear while Dan got to his feet and fended off the jabs. The second hidden personal guardsman used the surprise of his brother's attack to sneak behind and connect solidly with his hammer on Dan's left shoulder blade, knocking him down a second time. That shot really hurt him. Dan winced in pain, but moved quickly lest he take another deadly shot. Dan parried the thrust of the forked spear and then dodged the swatting hammer. Dan then leapt over both attacks and slashed at their arms and wrists. The giant wielding the spear was disarmed, but swatted at Dan with his bloody gauntleted fist. Dan was knocked down a third time after being thrown back, impacting into the wall. Another massive blow impacted the mountain itself, and the wall collapsed on top of Dan. The fire giants did not stop their attack to wonder why the wall collapsed, or what power pounded away on their fortress. They picked through the fallen rock to find Dan and finish him. Dan emerged under a heavy portion of stone that had fallen on top of him. The giant punched down on him twice, but Dan managed to roll away from his third punch. He lifted himself up, and as the giant closed in to grapple and pin, Dan thrust Silveroon up into his neck. The other personal guardsman struck down forcefully with his hammer. This time Dan was ready and was able to parry the powerful blow. It then shoved the weighty head of the hammer at Dan repeatedly, forcing him to make defensive steps back and parry the barrage of shots. Finally, the angry giant cornered Dan and fixed his rancor-filled orange eyes upon him. It raised the heavy hammer up high to finish him. As the giant struck, Dan saw his opportunity and spun into the shot and struck down with Silveroon on top of the hammer, forcing it further into the smashed rock floor. Dan then leapt up onto the giant's massive arms and slashed them. He then struck the giant in the head twice, before leaping away as it fell to the ground in a massive armored pile of steaming blood and guts. Dan crashed into the pile of fallen rocks that had gathered there on the floor. He struggled to regain his feet. He was nearly exhausted, but the haste magic and his desire for revenge kept him going. Down a narrow hallway, Dan heard a female and also some much younger giants crying out. They looked at Dan in horror as he stood up again. They retreated hastily back to their quarters, slamming the heavy door behind them.
Zurlus!
Dan yelled out with all his remaining breath as another massive blow was brought upon the external face of the mountain. Huge pieces of rock fell from the ceiling, and the hallway to Zurlus's chamber filled with dust. From out of the dust came the fire giant king. His eyes glowed red through the dust and debris that continued to fall. He was now equipped in his full plate armor and was adorned with the hide of Jarmia, the sash he treasured. His neck flexed with rage as he drew the ancient sword of kings, which burned always. It glowed red with fire as Zurlus made slow but deliberate steps towards Dan. Seeing the mountain giants pounding away on the mountain that housed Saitafetin was an extraordinary sight. It was a successful ploy, so wildly beyond my expectations, and so incredibly forceful that as I ran towards the dragon's hole, I couldn't help but laugh. Thelb picked up on the sheer absurdity of the situation. To think we were heading into the very mountain these giants were busy destroying. We were both so overwhelmed by emotions, we couldn't help but indulge in nervous laughter. I figured because we both knew it may be our last chance to do so. When we reached the entrance, the rocky floor was still covered in dragon scales, and several of the trolls were coming out. They were fleeing like rats from a burning building. As they passed us, they hissed, but then turned and kept moving into the rocky canyon. Several more followed, blocking us for a while, but after a few minutes we were able to make our entrance. The ploy had worked. They saw and smelled us as drow. It was a horrible feeling to be that close to these hideous creatures again. But they were terrified. The whole mountain, it seemed, was coming down on them. We may have appeared more drow-like, but neither of us held their keen sight in darkness, so I used a light incantation on my cutlass so I could see my way through the dust-filled cavern. We both coughed as we struggled to traverse the tightening passage that was filled occasionally with more loathsome trolls fleeing desperately from the collapsing caverns. When we reached the steel gate that held the deadbolt, we found that the desperate trolls and any other troglodytes that fled with them had no thoughts of return. They had left it wide open. The huge front doors of Saitafetin were also opened, but from out of that massive portal came an army of angry fire giants, determined to destroy whatever was attacking the fortress. When they saw it was the mountain giants, they called out in a common giant's tongue. But the mountain giants responded by stepping and swatting down on their much smaller cousins. Nuno was atop one of the giants, close to his ear, chanting and giving instructions. The fire giants gathered around the huge attacker and started taking shots at the mountain giant's feet and ankles. Some leapt onto the leg of the ancient titan and started crawling up its leg to get a more opportune shot. The mountain giant reached down with his massive hands and grabbed and then flung the feisty fire giants far away into the rocky ravine below. Another fire giant flung hunks of flaming rock at the mountain giant, causing its legs to catch fire. As ever more of the fire giants encircled him, the colossal giant stepped away and climbed atop the mountain face, right above where the massive marble double doors had been constructed. The mountain giant jumped up as high as it could and brought all of its massive weight on the cliff face above the front gates, causing the entire structure to cave in. As Zurlus came closer, He reached for a lever in the hall just outside his private quarters. This released a shower of molten lava onto him. He grabbed a handful of the lava and, with great relish, flung the fiery clump of lava at Dan. Dan dodged the impact, but the lava spattered around him, causing fires and smoke to fill the narrow passage. Dan was burned and unable to breathe, so he retreated back to the larger throne room. Zurlus made massive pounding steps as he hurled several other globs of lava in Dan's direction. The fire protection magic helped, but being hit by one of the globs would certainly kill him. Dan called out,
Kaylee, where are you?
There was no response. Once again, there was a thunderous shaking of the mountain, and the whole throne room filled with dust and debris. Zurlus entered, unaffected by the toxic sulfuric air. He smiled, spoke to Dan in his own dialect, and hurled more lava at him. Dan climbed up the stairs to the dais, and then climbed atop the throne, where he awaited the king. Dan looked throughout the dust-filled hall, but could not see anyone else. Kaylee, it appeared, was long gone. Zurlus then charged up the dais and stabbed his flaming sword at Dan in an attempt to pry him off his ancient throne. Dan swatted at his fire sword with Silveroon. This weapon Zurlus wielded was different from that of the other fire giants. It too was enhanced in ancient times by the supernatural. Zurlus swiped back, and Dan was caught in the chest by his blow and flung off the throne and into the dusty rock pile behind it. Dan was now nearly exhausted. The haste magic, as well as his other magic protections, were wearing off. Zurlus was fresh and filled with rage. He pounded down shots on Dan. Dan dodged two and then fended off another, struggling to hold on to Silveroon and unable to regain his feet. Another thunderous impact was then inflicted on the mountain, and one of the massive pillars in the hall split and fell right on top of Zurlus. Dan ignored his intense pain and tiredness and used the opportunity to charge him, using all the speed and force he could muster to thrust Silveroon into the fire giant king's chest. Zurlus then grabbed Dan with his powerful black hands, while Dan used all of his remaining strength to drive Silveroon deeper into his chest. Zurlus squeezed Dan with all of his incredible strength, causing his ribs to crack audibly. They both groaned in agony, but neither would yield. Their eyes met with pure hatred for each other, and neither would release their grip, waiting for the other to finally cede his life. Dan could not breathe. His consciousness was fading. He used the very last bit of energy he could muster to push even deeper into the fire giant king's chest. The giant's grip lessened slowly as his orange eyes flared at Dan with contempt. Then there was another huge impact on the mountain, and a pile of rocks and dust covered them both. The whole of the giants was brought down. The passage was unrecognizable. The fire giants that emerged to battle the mountain giants were all killed, and the mountain giants' anger was now sated. They called out to each other in their subsonic dialect, and then the one Nuna was riding explained they were done. Nuna did not question them. She simply prayed to her gods that what she had initiated would not be judged as too harsh or disruptive to the natural order of things. She did not thank them. She simply melded into the forest and returned home to the Iardet. She had done what I had asked and could do no more. Kaylee emerged from her own sphere of protection and made her way towards the pile of rubble that lay atop the fallen giant king. First, she labored to pull Silveroon from Zurlus's body, her face filled with glee as she finally held the sword in her own hands. She then searched through the rubble for Dan. She was hopeful he was still alive, not out of love or care, but because she had special plans for him. When she located his body, he was covered in dirt and completely motionless. She felt his neck for a pulse and found he was barely alive. but that was enough. She then teleported them both to her underground sanctum. Kaylee then stripped Dan of all of his armor and clothes. Rather than administer any immediate healing or passionate consolidation to her wounded prince, she fitted herself with the girdle of giant strength, which held the scabbard for Silveroon. She returned the sword proudly to its scabbard. They would now both be hers. Dan coughed and moaned. His heart continued to beat, but he had lost so much blood and sustained so many wounds that he was nearly dead already. The after effects of the haste magic were drastic lethargy. When combined with the wounds and his physical exhaustion, it was a miracle he remained alive. Kaylee comforted him sardonically as she climbed atop him for the last time.
Shh. Yes. Rest, my love. You've accomplished your mission. Your gods are so pleased.
She mused, wiping his face gently with a dampened cloth. As she whispered slowly into her dying lover's ear, a giant black spider approached Kaylee from behind. Its body was twice the size of any man, with hairy legs that spanned 30 feet in diameter. It shadowed behind Kaylee ominously as she squatted atop Dan's immobilized body. She climbed up onto his chest, her hands pressing firmly on either side of his neck. She licked his face while squeezing his broken ribs firmly with her powerful thighs. Dan did not even have the energy to open his eyes. In his mind's eye, he saw only his mother, who had pleaded for him to run and achieve vengeance for his family's murder.
Moti,
he cried out. His mother smiled at him and now waved for him to come join her now with the rest of his family. Kaylee raised her hands into the air as the giant spider crept in silently behind her. Her left hand, still emblazoned with the Eye of Souls, burned into her palm.
Thank you, my beloved,
she said, reaching her hands back for the 2 fangs of the mighty spider, which released them from her gooey mouth and into Kaylee's waiting hands. Kaylee then thrust them down violently, like daggers into either side of Dan's exposed chest. He opened his eyes momentarily as his lifeblood was drawn from his body. With his last glimpse of this world, he could see Kaylee's beautiful face above him, smiling while she drained the very essence of his life from his broken body. Through Dan's fading eyes, she appeared as if one with the hideous spider that lurked directly behind her. Dan looked into her eyes with one last moment of fearful uncertainty, and then he closed them again forever. Kaylee then raised the blood-filled dagger fangs up to the spider, which collected them in its nefarious palps, returning them into its body, where it then stored the sweet blood of the greatest human hero in ages. By this time, Thelb and I were totally lost in that dark underground. I thought somehow I would have found better intuition for finding my way to him, but these passages were once lava tubes, now filled with dust and debris. They all looked the same. The mountain giants had ceased their pounding, which made us both unsure what we should do next.
Nuna may be in trouble. Perhaps we should aid her,
Thelb suggested meekly. It was then I had an idea. I remembered the divination magic where I could locate any object. I had used it many times to find stolen and missing artifacts for profit. As long as I had seen the thing, or had a decent description, and could get within a mile of it or so, it was usually fairly effective. I could not divine Dan's location, but I could use that magic to lead me to Silveroon. Moments after completing the divination, I was certain I knew the way.
What are you doing?
Thelb asked.
This way,
I said confidently. We weren't going back to check on Nuna. Not now. I could feel the sword pulling me towards it. I think my location magic really only helped it find me. I ran through the dark, barren halls, with Thelb following behind cautiously. He was whistle call responding to try to keep up with my location. I reached a portal with a staircase leading down. There was a banner which had a family spider crest at the top. I deciphered the writing. "Zistiri," I said. "This is it." We descended the stairs and passed an iron gate that had also been left ajar. There were no visible guards or civilians. Had they fled also? As we took a few more anxious steps closer, we heard voices in a harsh Elvish dialect. The voices were coming from beyond an open door to our right. It sounded like an argument, but who knew with these dreaded mare creatures?
Go on.
Whispered Thelb behind me.
I'll take care of this.
He then readied himself for a surprise attack on the occupants. I took a few precarious steps further down the hall. When I reached a T at the end of the hall, 2 drow servants whisked past me. I ducked deftly against the wall so as not to betray my invisibility. The servants ran into the room where Thelb was, and one of them let out a horrible shriek. A servant girl then ran out as Thelb pursued, tackling her and stabbing her several times until she was silenced. He was visible now and waved in my direction.
Go. Keep moving,
he whispered, looking very much like the drow assassin he was posing as. I wasn't sure which way to turn next, since my divination told me each way was correct, so I chose left. The pathfinding magic was fading. As I moved quickly down the next hall, I found a few empty cells. I looked for any sign of Dan, but did not see any prisoners or any of his things. To my right was a thin drapery. I peeked through and saw it was a side entrance to the High Priestess's temple. I entered carefully. I observed the dark temple, completely unaware there was a giant spider hovering silently above me. I was still invisible to it, but my very steps through the temple could be felt in tremors in her web. This motion detection was then passed on to Kaylee, who was in her laboratory suiting up with her new toys she had just stolen from Dan. I left the temple and crossed the hall to another door, just missing Kaylee as she came out of the door to her laboratory, heading briskly for the temple. Thelb had dispatched another 2 of Kaylee's remaining male guards and a couple more of her servants quietly. He moved quickly in the direction he thought I took, but I no longer responded to his subtle whistles. He moved into the temple and then noticed Kaylee approaching in the hall. Thelb hid in a shadow by the doorway, but Kaylee had already been alerted someone was there, so surprise was impossible. She was ready for his backstabbing attack. As Thelb closed in, she turned and countered by holding him. She laughed aloud when she saw him stuck in her powerful enchantment. "Really? You thought you could secret your way into my temple and kill me?" She stepped closer and smiled. "Who are you?" Thelb did not respond. He could not respond, as even his lips were held by Kaylee's powerful magic. His eyes were fixed on her, his hand still gripping the broadsword firmly. "What's that?" she said as she released him from the spell. She then struck with amazing speed before he could regain his posture and raise his broadsword in defense. The sword was flung away and his neck was slashed. Thelb fell onto his knees. Kaylee then forced Silveroon deep into his belly and lifted him up with her newfound giant strength. Thelb was skewered by the sword. He looked into her eyes with great fear and intense disappointment. "Nothing to say?" she said callously as she flung him back down onto the ground. Thelb tried to overcome the mortal wound and pull himself up. He tried to gather himself to perform one last spell, but before he could speak, she stepped in and swung the sword again, beheading him. It was only upon further inspection that she noticed his face had been disguised. She held his decapitated head, still trying to recognize the house of the assassin, and in doing so, noticed his makeup was rubbing off on her hands. She wiped some of the black coloring away from his lifeless face, revealing his gray mountain elf skin below. Kaylee smiled as she realized who he was. He was the elf that had stabbed and nearly killed her 3 centuries before now at Tel Suma. That fateful day, I was conceived. It was a wound that she could still feel and see. It was the same pesky mountain elf she had seen briefly at the Battle of Voss when she claimed Ozymandias' body and treasures. But by then, she also realized the odds of this high elf coming down here alone were extremely unlikely. So she returned quickly to her quarters. I had made my way into her quarters first, and I saw Dan's lifeless body, draped in blood, on Kaylee's bed. I raced over to him and became visible so he could see me as I resuscitated him. I had a couple of healing potions in my tiny bag, but as I was with the fly, I was too late for Dan. He had been taken from me again. This time, it was forever. Despite Theb's instructions, I sobbed over him, hugging his body as his cold blood covered my chest. "How precious," Kaylee said behind me, looming in the doorway to her subterranean palace. My heart was filled with rage. In that moment, I no longer knew fear, because I no longer had any reason to continue living. All that remained in my heart was the intense desire to kill this drow bitch. It was all I had left in this world to do. I growled at her like a tiger as I pulled out my 2 new cutlasses. I then charged at her like a northern berserker. She smiled at my rage and welcomed my attack. My new cutlasses were both feckless blades against the power of Silveroon. The 2 cutlasses were cut down by the simple defensive parries of Silveroon, like twigs striking against a stone wall. I continued to swing at her defiantly until only the crossguards on each weapon remained in my hands. She then laughed aloud as she slashed the sword back at me. I thought I dodged it, but the very tip of Silveroon grazed my left shoulder. Normally, I wouldn't have even noticed such an impact, but this grazing blow was like being hit by a giant boulder. I was knocked to my knees in excruciating pain. Since both of my weapons were now destroyed, my next thought was simply to jump her, bite her face, and then tear her eyes out of her skull with my bare hands. But as I leapt up at her, she punched me squarely in the stomach, which sent me careening into the rock wall some 20 feet behind. I bounced off the wall and landed on my face. I was totally dazed and disoriented, coughing up blood as I gasped unsuccessfully for breath. Kaylee's piercing evil cackle echoed through the empty room and into the adjacent halls. "So here at last, come for her fabled revenge, is the daughter of Puale, the promised elven restorer. How profoundly quaint. High elves. You copper skins are the worst of them." She laughed as she approached. She grabbed my hair violently and then pulled my head up to get a better look at my black painted face. "I'm impressed you made it this far. Are there any others?" she asked interrogatively. I could not speak. I could only spit out more blood that was filling my lungs in each gasping breath. She had crushed my intestines with that gut punch. The giant strength of Dan's girdle was brought to bear fully on my tender stomach, with the high-density impact of Kaylee's dainty fist. "Good," she said. "I have many things to do." She then walked demonstratively, with sultry steps of her perfectly proportioned body. She walked slowly towards her temple, dragging me behind her by the hair on the cold stone floor. When we reached the temple, I saw Theb's wasted carcass on the ground. I saw it only briefly before Kaylee hoisted me up violently by the hair launching me over the unholy altar of her spider goddess. But I did not impact the wall again. This time I landed into a giant spider's web. She acted disgusted as she wiped the chunks of hair from her hands that had been pulled from my head by her malicious throw. "More living flesh for you, my pet," Kaylee said, looking above me as she continued to wipe her dainty hands like a fly. I was able to turn my head upwards slightly and saw the hideous giant spider waiting patiently above me. It did not move as I struggled in the web to regain my equilibrium. "I think she's too full on the blood of your lover, my woodland sister. But that's all right. She'll become hungry again soon." She laughed and stepped away from the altar. I was stuck, upside down somewhat, with my arms stuck to the web, extended outwards, and my legs wrapped one over the other. I continued to cough out blood. Fortunately for me, the natural pull of my weight towards the ground was working in my favor. The scarf that was hidden in my leather bracer, the same one Dan had given to me in Voss, was clumping up towards my hand. It seemed to move on its own, ever closer to my waiting open palm, like it wanted very much out of hiding. I used my right hand desperately, trying to catch my fingers on the small piece of cloth that was extending out of the bracer to the edge of my palm. As Kaylee laughed at my suffering and relished in her taunts of victory, I was clawing feverishly at the small strand of dememony cloth she must have purchased somewhere in her drow homeland many years ago. "The time will come soon. Unfortunate that you'll never get to see it, bastard elf. Our kind will rule all others from below. Your kind suffers these humans because you are weak, just like the giants." She then grabbed Theb's headless body and flung it angrily up onto the web beside me. "Say goodbye to your friend," she said, holding Theb's severed head in her hands mockingly, making his mouth move as if he was talking. "Goodbye." Then she tossed his head intentionally close to my face. As I looked at Theb's shattered body, I felt so sorry. So sorry for believing in myself, and that I might be able to make any impact on this battle, or any other. The giant spider reset its legs in anticipation of balling us up in webs. What a horrific way for us to go, I thought. "I'm sorry, old friend. You were right. As always," I told him. It was just then I felt two of my fingers pin the small piece of cloth to my palm. I scraped desperately with my other fingers, gathering more of the cloth until I could grab it with all of my fingers. I then pulled on the cloth, using my entire wrist. As more and more of the cloth emerged from beneath the leather bracer, the scarf became undone, and pieces of broken mirror glass began to fall like loose diamonds onto the stone floor below. Kaylee heard the shards falling and took an amused interest into what I was doing. I could now feel an intense heat emanating from within the scarf. Kaylee came closer. She then looked down to the glass pieces that lay on the stairs to the altar and noticed they were all tiny bits of a broken mirror. When she realized what it was, she then looked up to me in abject horror. Her pompous grin had vanished. Terror now consumed her face. I then pulled the Eye of Souls out completely from the bracer, and it fell to the ground, smoking with orange, green, blue, and yellow timescapes, opening portals from the astral plane. As it bounced on the stone floor, Kaylee chased after it desperately. But before she reached where it finally landed, several heavily armored members of the Forgotten Army were already there, direct from Baron Brawl. She struck at them with Silveroon, as several more appeared behind them. The army of the Forgotten swelled quickly and overwhelmed her, grabbing hold of her arms with much anger. They then wrested the sword from her grip. More entered as they lifted her off the ground while she screamed in agony. Several more appeared, and then several others. The giant spider leapt off the web and attempted to aid her, but the Forgotten army surrounded and struck the giant spider down quickly. The angry Forgotten tore Kaylee's body limb from limb. They then ripped her to small pieces, and then into even smaller pieces. One of the Forgotten, the one now chosen to be the Sword Watcher, approached me in the web. It looked at me strangely as the Eye of Souls was reattached to Silveroon's hilt, like a young child returning to the arms of its mother. I understood that I needed to pay the price for my part in this theft. But for some reason that remains unknown, the Sword Watcher simply swiped Silveroon at the web, releasing me, and I fell to the ground. He then left me there and joined the others, returning their sacred prize back home with them to Baron Braun. After the Forgotten left me, I maintained some hope that Dan might still be clinging to life, with a chance that he might be able to be revived. So I endured the intense pain I felt throughout my shattered abdomen and forced myself back on my feet. I pulled Dan's girdle of giant strength from Kaylee's flesh pile and put it on me to have the strength to move, despite the intense pain in my abdomen. I stood up in sheer agony and then made several slow, painful steps down the hallway and into the priestess's chamber, until I was back to Dan's side where he lay. I gasped for many short breaths as I pulled the teleportation scroll that Thelb had given me from my tiny bag. I wasn't certain if I could verbalize all the semantics properly, but staying there was not an option. I spoke the words and managed to teleport us back to Gareth's laboratory at Tel Suma. Gareth was there with Nuna, who was explaining happily what happened outside the gates of Zaitefetin. Then she saw me appear, yet with another human brought to Tel Suma against their tenet. I was badly injured, with my face consumed in tears and blood.
Help him,
I pleaded.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. It was a pleasure to be lent your ears for this adventure. I'd also like to offer my sincere thanks to all of my Patreon supporters. Thanks to you, many more people are aware of this story. And my excellent subscribers, your encouragement keeps me going. Thank you for being there. If you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, and ring the bell for notifications so you never miss an episode. And please leave a comment below. I love to hear your impressions. And as always, be sure to share this story with all of your friends on your favorite social media.